Hi everyone, welcome to the first of 4 online modules for LTCY 536. The topic for this module and for your reading is ethnography. It is one of the more popular forms of methodology used in literacy research, and we're going to walk through some of its principal tenets, and I hope that this PowerPoint will help guide your reading and guide the reading of the 2 studies that I've chosen for you to read. So ethnography falls under that paradigm or that category of qualitative research. And so when we ask what is qualitative research, we're talking about naturalistic inquiry. We're not creating an experiment. We are not trying to see if something is caused by something else. We are not trying to control conditions as we might in the lab. We're trying to examine phenomena that occur naturally, whether that's in classrooms, in clubs or out of school activities, or with particular social groups. So the focus is on the social phenomena, meanings, ideas, experiences. And as a result of that, it ends up becoming inductive analysis, meaning the researcher should not be going in a priori with a set of assumptions about what they're going to find. The analysis is conducted by reading and rereading the field notes and the themes and generating themes that start to emerge as a result of their time in the field. So ultimately, it takes this holistic perspective on the phenomenon and the social groups being studied. And so it is really relying then on rich data sets, meaning copious field notes, interviews, things of that nature. And then within those, what Clifford Geertz, the anthropologist, referred to as thick descriptions. And so the notes are taken as in such a manner that as I'm reading them, it's like I'm there. So as a result, the researchers oftentimes are immersed in the field, and they're very much, they can either be an active participant or sometimes they might act as an outside observer, but they quickly immerse themselves in the field itself. So what it's aiming to do, qualitative research, is aiming to explore the subjective world, not the truths that are out there necessarily, but to provide an in-depth understanding of people's experiences, behaviors, perspectives, and histories, and the meanings that they ascribe in the context of their personal circumstances or settings. So when we're in qualitative research, we're really going to look, the context becomes really, really important. So the context of the particular school, the context of the particular group of individuals in which those people hang out with, the community in which the school is nested in. So the context really, really matters. Now, ethnography, which falls under qualitative research, is a really intense and rigorous exercise and methodology. The main purpose of ethnography is to obtain a deep understanding of people and their culture. It really comes out of anthropological work. And one of its distinguishing features is this notion of field work. So what that means then is ethnographers immerse themselves in the life of the people they study, and they seek to place the phenomena studied in their social and cultural context. So some really good examples outside of education, if you've read Sudhir Venkatesh's Gang Leader for a Day. So here was this sociology student at the University of Chicago who wanted to study Chicago street gangs and ended up hanging out with the street gang. And actually at one point they took him in so much that he was named the gang leader for the day, and had to make some really difficult and in case criminal decisions. That might be a more extreme context, but that's often the type of immersion that ethnographers place themselves in. They become a part of the context itself. And so in that sense, it defines what the situation is and makes it what it is. And that becomes really important. So in terms of the methods for ethnography, field work is defined as the study of people and their culture and their natural habitat. Again, we see this anthropological background. Anthropological fieldwork has been characterized by the prolonged residence of the investigator, his or her participation in and observation of the society, and his or her attempt to understand the inside view of Native peoples. Um, and so, again, it becomes lots of participating and observing. Um, but you can sort of get a sense, too, here in terms of ethnography, that it's often this outsider that's coming in to observe this other group. So ethnography draws upon other qualitative methods, which includes the use of interviews, group discussions, engaging in participatory activities, and they're also influenced by other theories such as phenomenology, which is trying to understand phenomenon, feminism, grounded theory, or postmodernism. All of these theories ultimately trying to inform and shape how one might view the world. So if we were looking at, for example, if we were going to conduct an ethnography on the literate practices of girls, and some of the people from the Rockford cohort read that book on the lives of middle school girls, one might take a feminist perspective to say, well, how is gender impacting how these girls are experiencing their literate lives and literate selves within a particular school context? That's one example. Okay, so participant observation, which obviously, again, is really important, means that we're learning to see, describe, remember, and to become aware. In that sense, then, the researcher has to participate in everyday life, and the researcher then also has to conduct detailed observations of behavior and interpersonal communication. And then they make direct observation of significant events. So they're actually going to and experiencing the events that their participants are engaging in. So I'll give you an example. So in the Kirkland article that you'll read in We Real Cool, David, the researcher, was hanging out with these kids in these after-school events. So if they were hanging out on the corner, then he was there. If they were eating at a restaurant, then he was there. In the case of Purcell Gates, she would go to their house and see what was going on, or go to the after-school activities that they were participating in. So it's spending extended period living in a community, learning the language, understanding social life, and gaining familiarity with customs. But one also needs permission to enter the community, which may need to be negotiated. So it's not like you can just show up and say, here, I'm this researcher, I want to do these things. We're really talking about a level of trust and that needs to be established. And so in that sense, too, the researcher is known to the community. It's not like you're hiding out and lurking in the shadows and saying, I'm going to collect research like Facebook did and not tell you about it. That's unacceptable, and that's not the purpose of ethnography. The purpose of ethnography is to say, here I am, I'm a part of this community, I want to become a part of this community, I want to study this community, because I think it offers really valuable insights. So what are some things that can be observed? Well, places and contexts. So the overall, the geography and the social context, but also the physical environment. So even in an ethnography of a classroom, how is the classroom arranged? Is it in rows? Are they in tables? Those sorts of things. Particular objects which people might be engaged with. So whether one might be looking at the use of mobile technologies and the different smartphones and iPads and MP3 players that people interact with. And then also observing people. And so there's lots of people, so you have to decide who are you observing, how many people might you observe, and then what are the roles of those particular people in that context. Then we can also look at activities, what, when, are they recurrent activities, are they some unique type of activity. We could observe behaviors, interactions, and as well as symbolic meanings of words, nonverbal communication, as well as non-linguistic representation, so art, graffiti, cartoons, etc. So why observe? So why is this so important to ethnography? Well, it allows the establishment of good relationships because you're there together. It enhances the understanding of settings and contexts. In one way, we think of ethnography as trying to make the familiar strange. That's a phrase used by ethnographers, and the point of that is that even in the most familiar of circumstances. So let's take a classroom. Oh, we all know what classrooms look like. By really observing deeply in a classroom, we might uncover things that we never knew or realized were there. And also observations then can be grounded. So questions can be asked in appropriate ways and in local terminology based on what one sees in the field. And then there's this notion of data triangulation, that you can compare accounts, you can take statements of ideal behaviors. Like, so let's say you conducted an interview and the people said, well, we do this, this, and this, and yet you observe you either confirm that through observation, or that might be disconfirmed through some observation. And it also allows questions to be asked on a continuing basis, because you're continuing to observe and notice how things change, and that might spark new questions. That all said, there are risks and difficulties to conducting ethnography. Community entry may take a long time. So let's take this again into the field of literacy. As adults, or as a literacy researcher, they're going in and they're going to say, well, I want to hang out with 15-year-olds or 10-year-olds or whatever it is. That may take some time. So I want you to think about that. For example, with Kirkland's study in We Real Cool, as well as in Purcell Gates' study, I never read my own words. How might they have gained entry into the community? And then tensions between groups and individuals might affect data collection. Certain things may, if there are conflicts or things like that, people might not want that reported. Observations may change the usual behavior of an individual or community. We change what we do, and we know we're being watched. Think about when you're being observed in the classroom, how you might be more conscious of the words you're saying, or you might feel less relaxed or more relaxed based on that. Research may also provoke greater reflection and analysis among participants than is usual. So they might start engaging in these reflections and asking their own questions when normally they wouldn't do that, but because you're there, they become really reflective. The researcher and the community may find it difficult to clarify the role of the researcher. That can become a conflict. And then finally, observation and participation will always be selective and partial. The meaning of that is you can only be at one place at one time, so you're not always seeing everything in the context. You can, whether you're at a meeting, whether you're in a classroom, whether you're with a group of individuals in a particular community context, but there's other things going on, obviously, so you're still only able to take a small slice. It's difficult to generalize on the basis of case studies and ethnographies because they are so contextually dependent. And so really this approach cannot be used for large populations. And as such then, that's okay. But participant observation is not designed to establish causal relationships. We cannot make sweeping claims about X, Y, or Z based on the observations of a particular individual or particular community context. And one of the things that can happen then is we can become susceptible to focus on the abnormal or the aberrant or the exceptional because they become really interesting, but that might not really be representative of the context. So some other methodological problems are observing only the unusual then. So we might only observe these unusual circumstances. Going into a context and taking field notes day after day, week after week, month after month can lead to fatigue and boredom on the researcher's part. Sometimes we get inadequate recordings. Either we can't capture it via digital technology, the voice won't pick up everything, or the fact that the observer might be so immersed as a participant that they can't possibly be jotting everything down, and so they're going to have to rely on taking notes after the fact. These are oftentimes complex, large, or busy settings. You might have recall problems if not recorded immediately after. Waiting until the night or the next day can become problematic. And again, there's always, because it's qualitative and it's so interpretive, we always have to be mindful of making assumptions. So that leads to this idea in ethnographic research of reflexivity. Reflexivity is the conscious self-examination of the ethnographer's interpretive role. So it's your, if you're the ethnographer, it's your own reflection upon your role in the context. So that has to take then into consideration the construction of ethnographic authority, meaning as the outside observer, you're not really a part of this community. How much authority or the statements that one makes about what they're observing really needs to undergo this reflexive practice. Anthropologists paid closer attention to interactional processes through which they acquired, shared, and transmitted knowledge. So again, we see this relationship back to anthropology. Okay, so let's say now one wants to conduct an ethnography. What about sampling? So we have different methods of sampling and how we decide this. So there's purposive sampling, meaning I know I want to go in and I know this is going on. I'll give you an example. I have a friend who is really interested in digital technologies, and there's this high school in Chicago Public Schools that have developed this, what they call this digital atelier, which is basically this digital playground. And he really wants to go in and study that. And so, there's not many of those, so he's purposely going into that particular school. There's snowball sampling, in which, you gain a relationship with one or two individuals, and then they might introduce you to others, and that leads to introducing to others, other schools, other teachers, other students, and then the sampling goes that way. There's opportunistic sampling because you're there or because you have a relationship with someone. There's theoretical sampling, so I want to make sure that I have a division of males and females, or age ranges, or experienced teachers, mid-career teachers, and new teachers, things like that. And then we always have to be thinking about sample size. So at what point might we reach saturation, or when do we have enough individuals or groups to look at? And then there's other units to be sampled. So what are we talking about? We could be talking about people, which I was sort of referencing, but we could also be sampling settings or places. So how many reading groups do we want to go to, or how many classes do we want to go to? We could be sampling events, so family reading nights and events at the public library, and book fairs and things like that are possibilities. And then also, like I said, people, but also things or artifacts. So do we want to sample homework and tests and quizzes and whatever that is, or digital constructions, so Facebook feeds and Twitter timelines and Instagram uploads. These are all things to consider. So again, here are some strategies for sampling. One might want to look at extreme or deviant cases, the aberrant, the exceptional. But again, that can lead to problems. Or we might want to have maximum variation sampling. So this is where we were talking about, having that range of ages, or range of ability levels, or range of experiences. We could do typical case sampling, where sort of have it be more random and representative. Or you could do homogeneous sampling, where you want to see, I want to look at all low readers or all high readers and see how they differ. We could be, so I want to go into a gifted class and do an ethnography in a gifted class, or a striving readers class. We could have stratified purposeful sampling, and so we can again stratify by age, by gender, by race, ethnicity, etc. Or we could do critical case sampling, and that can be broader to look at particular cases that could be really critical to look at. So they could be individuals or they could be groups. So, and I know we're not doing case study until the next week, but there are some differences then between ethnographies and case studies. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with the idea of a case study. Case studies come out of legal studies, actually. But in terms of ethnographic research, we see time commitment. If we compare these along, time commitment, orientation of the researcher, and the type of data collected. In ethnographic research, the time commitment is significantly longer. We're talking about months or years in the field sometimes. Whereas in a case study, it's less time required in the field, maybe a few weeks, a few months at the most. In terms of the orientation of the researcher, In ethnography, the purpose is to learn from people, whereas in case study, it's really more of studying people. And then in terms of types of data collected, we have interviews and documents and notes from fieldwork and participant observations, whereas in a case study, it's mostly, again, for studying people, they tend to be more objective, so more interviews and documents. So some practical suggestions in terms of how people conduct ethnographic research. Write up field notes on a regular basis, write it down, write up any interviews as soon as possible, regularly review and develop your ideas as the research progresses, and develop strategies to deal with a huge amount of data. You're talking about hundreds of pages of transcripts in particular. So if we look at, so some critiques of ethnographic research, advantages. It's one of the most valuable aspects is that this in-depth understanding that you're so immersed in the field, and it can really challenge these taken for granted assumptions. The disadvantages, though, is it takes a long time, and you don't have a lot of breadth because you're so narrowly focused on a small group. And it can be difficult then for someone to write up the findings for a journal or article. So I want you to think about that in terms of the 2 articles that you're going to read. Remember that these were long ethnographies, and yet they have page limits that are put on them in order to communicate all that they learned. Oftentimes, ethnographies are actually written up into books, but when people try to get them published for journal articles as well, that can be an additional challenge. So, these are some things I want you to think about on those 2 studies. 1, consider Purcell Gates's standards for quality. So this comes out of the chapter. So I want you to create a list of criteria for quality ethnographies. And you'll want to include avenues to ensure validity and reliability on those as well. So is this a valid case? Is it a valid thing to study? And how reliable is the data being gathered by the researcher? Can we trust it? Okay. And then consider We Real Cool and I Ain't Never Read, those 2 articles, and use that criteria you've established to determine whether or not this is an example of a quality ethnography, and be prepared to defend your answer on that, as well as being prepared to share on the group or the discussion board ultimately. Okay? And then here are some other considerations as you're reading those. Is this a contribution to the field? So is this a contribution to the field of literacy research? What are we learning about literacy instruction as a result of these studies? Does the author offer rich insights? Has the author presented a sufficient amount of data, and has a sufficient amount of data been collected? And is there sufficient information about the methods used? So are they very transparent about how they collected their data? Those are things to think about when you read those ethnographies. So let's now talk about the features of educational research again. So I'm sort of shifting to this other reading that you've done. That each field has features that influence what questions are asked, how research is designed, how it's carried out, and how it's interpreted and generalized, which we see on page 80. And the methods of data collection are based on these decisions, based on the features of educational research. So while ethnography could come out of sociology, could come out of anthropology, they ask different questions than we do in education. So in order to do that, you have to think about the data sources that are available. And here's just some, whether it's documentation, public information, those sorts of things, archival records, physical artifacts, direct observation, participant observation, focus groups, interviews. These are all data sources that can go into collecting ethnographic data. And again, we're focused on ethnographic data in the context of education, whether that's education in spaces that are sanctioned, like schools, or unsanctioned spaces, like after-school activities or the literate practices that young people engage in at home, with their friends, in Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, whatever it is. So when you're engaged in these observational strategies, they may be unstructured, or they may be broadly focused, or they may be structured. So in unstructured, they can be broadly focused. So we're generalized again, infant feeding, drug injecting practices, etc. They're impressionistic and descriptive. So if we were to look at this from an educational standpoint, we could talk about recreational reading. Very generalized, right? Versus a structured observation, which we have a tighter focus on specific behaviors and issues that might be clearly defined. So, for example, use of mobile technology is an example. So every time a kid texts, Snapchats, Instagrams, Twitter feeds, Facebooks, whatever. Structured observations require continuous monitoring, spot checks, as well as rating checks. And so you can see that it's not just going somewhere and taking notes willy-nilly. We can see that we either are taking that continuous monitoring or recording presence and absence of behaviors, or we're actually giving some sort of rating scale along the way. Now, field notes can be continuous or intermittent, and what needs to be recorded are those ethnographic descriptions that need to be substantive. Remember that idea of a thick description. Analytic perceptions and interpretations, as well as the collection of visual records. So oftentimes ethnographers will have your phone and taking photographs, drawing maps of the physical space. All of that is really important. So some hints for taking good field notes: plan time to write up your field notes. Don't talk about memories before you write them up, because that will cloud that. Record as soon as possible. Remember the order of things. Note the date, the time, the location. Draw maps and distinguish between verbatim and summarized conversations. So what's direct quotes and what's just sort of the summary of the overall conversation. There are other methods that you could use, like keeping a checklist, where you walk around the room and track those behaviors. Or again, you could have that rating scale and use that scale at particular points in time. So at the beginning of the lesson, the middle of the lesson, and the end of the lesson, you could go through. And so as a result, checklists and rating scales have the advantage of being relatively easy to design, undemanding of time, and applicable to more than one child at a time. But they're limited to the specified traits and behaviors, and they lack that contextual information that's there. Another ethnographic method then is developing an interview. So you can describe the goals of a project, select the appropriate sample, and then develop those interview questions. And if again, some of this is thinking about conducting your own research, but also thinking about how research has been conducted. So were the interviewers trained, or were all the interviewers the research people? How did they conduct the interviews? Was there an interview protocol? Those are all important questions. When interviewing, we don't want to begin an interview cold. We want to be direct. We want to remember that you're there to get information. Some of these you laugh at them, but dress appropriately, find a quiet space where you will not be distracted. You might need to rephrase. The best thing to do is record interviews. Make the interview feel like an important part of the project, and thank the interviewee and ask if he or she has any other questions. So here are just some samples of interview questions and follow-up questions. So just take a few minutes to read through those as just good examples of particular samples. So one thing I'd like you to do is to construct 5 interview questions. I'm not collecting this, but just on your own, just to jot down 5 interview questions that would investigate the reading habits of struggling readers in either grades 3 through 5 or grades 6 through 8. I'm purposely delimiting this because I don't think we might look at struggling readers in grades K through 2. Not that we wouldn't look at struggling readers, but I want you thinking about when it really becomes like, okay, now we're looking at a struggling reader. You could add 9 to 12 on this if you'd like, but we'll keep it in those ranges. When you're collecting data, again, you're going to want to do some time or event sampling. So time sampling is an observation of what happens within a given period of time, coded with tallies or symbols while the behavior is occurring, and used to document the frequency of specific behaviors. So how often is something happening? Give you another example. How often does a teacher ask a particular type of question? How often do kids have the opportunity to read independently? Something like that. And then there's the event sampling, where observations of an event that has been defined in advance and what happens before or after will be briefly recorded while it's taking place, used to observe and record children's social and personal interactions with the teacher and other children as a basis to plan a desirable intervention. Now, we get to this question again then of trustworthiness or validity and reliability in educational research. So one is, what's a definition of trustworthiness? So one possibility might be when the evidence for the results reported is sound and when the argument made is based on the results is strong. So we want to make strategies for achieving trustworthiness a formal component of all research designs. If someone's going to make an assertion in any form of research, then we want to trust that that researcher has done due diligence and what we are reading, what they are representing, is not just trustworthy, but thinking about trustworthy in the sense that it's valid. It's valid what we're looking at, meaning it's not only aberrant unless they're going to say that, unless they're going to say this is an exceptional case, but it's valid based on the questions asked, and that it's reliable in the sense that it could be consistent, that it wasn't a random Monday that we saw this, but reliability in the sense that we've seen this pattern recur, and we've seen this pattern in multiple data sources, whether that's in the interview, the observation, the survey, the checklist, whatever. So, qualitative strategies for trustworthiness. One is to identify threats to understanding. So what are the things that might cloud your judgment? What are the blinders that could be on? What are the blind spots? And so a key question is, how might the researcher's understandings be wrong? What might they have missed or not looked at? And there's 4 kinds of understandings that qualitative research provides then. It provides descriptive understanding, interpretive understanding, theoretical understanding, and then this idea of generalizability, which again, we said that we couldn't generalize to a particular context, but we might be able to make some general theoretical statements as a result of combining when we see this in multiple cases or multiple ethnographies. So let's look at description. So if we look at these categories, descriptive, interpretive, theoretical. Descriptive validity. Could the description be wrong? Descriptive accounts must be factually accurate where physical, concrete, or behavioral details are agreed by both researcher and participants. So the main threat is inaccurate or incomplete evidence, and the main strategies to reduce that threat is to provide detailed evidence and triangulate your data sources, and what it would also include what's something called member checking, so checking back with the participants to make sure that you got your description right. In terms of interpretive validity, could the interpretation be wrong? So interpretations must be meaningful to the study participants or meaningful from the participant's perspective. So the main threat is imposing the researcher's own perspective, right? We all have our biases and they bring that. So again, the main strategies to reduce this threat is systematic testing of emergent interpretations against participants' words and actions. So again, going back to the data, going back to those descriptions, and again, member checks, checking and saying, am I interpreting this right? I saw this over 3 sessions, would you characterize this the way that I'm characterizing it? So now theoretical validity. Could the theory be wrong? So a theory must provide a good explanation for the phenomena being studied. Both concepts and the relationships among them must be valid. The main threat to theoretical validity is discrepant data, negative cases, or rival explanations that are not taken seriously. The main strategies to reduce these, then, are systematic attempts to find discrepant data and disprove alternative explanations. It was just a bad day? Or is there something going on and why that was a bad day? And we have to take that into consideration as well as the consensus of other researchers and their research. So now there's 2 kinds of qualitative generalization. There's internal, within the group or the site, but beyond those studied directly, and external to other groups. The main threat to internal generalizability is that those observed in interviews are not typical of a whole group. So again, we're not saying that all students, based on ethnography, but if we were to look at one honors class at one particular school in one particular district, we might be able to say something about honor students in that school. So the main strategy to reduce that threat is, again, purposeful sampling to make sure you have the widest number of cases. And again, surveying, using a survey to, which might be a way to generate that, to draw from that sample. So based on survey results, then deciding how you're going to sample. And here's just a quick note on reliability. Qualitative research does not attempt to eliminate variance between researchers or the researcher's influence. Okay, it's recognized that it's ethnography and that these are individuals, but it does attempt to illuminate how a researcher values expectations and background might influence the study. So the threat is that the researcher's influence is unclear, and so the strategy is to create audit trails and those reflexive notes about one's own process and make that very public. So I know that's a lot, and we will continue to go down this line because our next topic is case study, which is, again, qualitative in nature, and a type of qualitative research different from ethnography, as we saw in that chart, but an important part of qualitative research. I'm hoping that this gives you some insight and some things to think about especially as you read the chapter by Purcell Cates, and then read her work and read David Kirkland's work, and be thinking about the topics that we discussed on those slides, whether it's validity and reliability, or sampling, or the types of notes and data collected. Really thinking about those things as you go through and really tear apart those readings. And I look forward to seeing your discussion posts. And again, we only have 4 online modules, so I'm really looking for in these 4 online modules to have some really robust discussion on the discussion board.